3 years ago, I reviewed Man of Steel. Initially, that video started out as a review of Superman Returns, but between a lack of ability to track down a copy of it, this was before I had disposable income to purchase DVDs, and Man of Steel was on HBO a lot since it was a recent blockbuster, so I pivoted the review to that since I could watch it unedited on TV. Now that review has a lot of problems, and if I made it today, I would probably do it very different, like much of my earlier material. But since then, I kept the Superman Returns idea on the back burner because I could never quite crack the nut for the video. Yes, the movie could be fixed, but I wanted to look at it in a wholly positive light, since to be honest, I actually rather like the movie. That's not to say that it doesn't have flaws, but I didn't want to focus on what could have been, might have been, my ideas on what should have been. I wanted to shine a light, and perhaps some would say microscope, on what was. A recent post on Twitter that I can't find or remember what it said was positive about the movie and about Brandon Routh, who I think was the perfect actor to cast in the role. And it got me thinking, and I finally figured out how to break into this review. Not fixing Superman Returns, but defending it. But before we can defend the movie, we have to talk about something else. What makes a good Superman movie? For comparison, I'm going to use Superman 2 because ostensibly they attempt to achieve the same goal, continue the story left off by their predecessor. What made Superman 2 the classic that it's regarded as today? And I think it comes down to what people remember most about the movie. The Niagara Falls scene, Lois's quest to get Superman to reveal his identity when she figures it out, the brilliance of Terrence Stamp as General Zod, the other brilliance of Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, and despite the behind-the-scenes tumult, it's still one of the highest-rated Superman movies out there apart from the original. Superman is a hero and he saves the day, even if the ending is a little unsatisfying with the whole mind-wiping kiss thing. And Superman Returns wears the influence of Donner Superman movies on its sleeve. They even have John Williams back to do the score, along with reusing his classic theme. So why was it so maligned at the time? Well, it wasn't. In fact, in December of 2006, the year it was released, its Rotten Tomatoes score was actually a % higher than it is right now, a decade plus later. But if it was a good movie, why did it take 7 years to get another live-action Superman movie, and how come we never got a sequel to that one? A criticism that I've seen throughout many of the negative reviews is that Brandon Routh lacks charisma as Superman. In fact, Roger Ebert himself said that in his review of the film back when it came out. But I disagree. I think he does have charisma as Superman, though his version of Superman is much different than the ones that came before and after. Brandon Routh has shown the ability to be charismatic and cheesy as Ray Palmer on Arrow, The Flash, and Legends of Tomorrow. So if there is a problem with charisma, which I don't see, it's either the writing or Kate Bosworth being a subpar Lois Lane and not giving Routh the chemistry that he needs to bounce. Bosworth is not a bad actress, but she doesn't bring the same personality that Margot Kidder brought to the role. Routh, in fact, is one of the only actors I've ever seen able to not only look like Reeve, but to also inhabit the role in the same way. He put his own spin on it to be sure, but he was able to give different personalities between the two roles in a way that really only Reeve was ever able to do. Take, for example, the scene where Clark returns to the Daily Planet. He's not nearly as awkward as Reeve, who had it down to a science, but it is an awkward scene, able to evoke the feeling in me, which makes it work. And then when he's Superman saving people, especially in the trailer scene with the bullets just bouncing off of him, he is both, and he does it better than Cavill has. Cavill is the same in both personalities. He's not a sheepish reporter, he's a confident reporter. In Batman v Superman, Clark confronts Perry White. Reeve's Superman would never do that because it's not what Clark Kent would do. Clark Kent is a pushover. If anyone is going to confront Perry about a story, it should be Lois. Superman Returns got the relationship between Clark Kent and Superman right. Not perfect, but correctly enough that I'm sure that if there was a sequel, the kinks would have been ironed out. Others have argued that the movie isn't packed with enough action, with the first real action sequence not happening until a half hour into the movie. But that's because it's a character-driven story. My problem with action movies is that nowadays they have to start on a big action set piece to draw the viewers in. But that means that we can't get to have any intimate time with our characters until much later. Star Wars is the king of big action set piece to draw in the viewers, but they also started out with a crawl that explains the premise so that we know what's going on and have an idea of who these people are. Superman Returns seeks to establish the story before jumping into the action, which is damn refreshing. I am sick of action set pieces with no regard for story. A key aspect of screenwriting is establishing the goals of the character from the get-go. And just because you're some hotshot director who's made a bunch of movies doesn't mean that you can forego the rules whenever you want. I mean, it does mean that, but it shouldn't. This movie takes the time to establish where we are. It cares enough to truly return Superman to us. They could have totally started out on the spaceplane sequence and have Superman's return, being him showing up in the nick of time to save Lois, but they didn't. We get extended sequences where we establish the mirror between Superman and Lex, where they both leave the women responsible for setting them on their paths. Ma Kent being Superman's tether to humanity, and Noel Neill, the original Lois Lane by the by, setting Lex up with the funds he needs to achieve his evil goals. And it gives us, right off the bat, showing Superman's goodness and Lex's evil, plain and simple. We don't need to show Lex going on a rampage. He comforts a dying woman, showing humanity, and then reveals that it was all a charade and mercilessly abandons her body and family once he gets her money. It is an utterly brilliant sequence that people write off because, how come Superman isn't kicking ass and saving the day from the start? Because Superman has been gone. Both in story and in real life. There hadn't been a theatrical Superman film since Superman 4, and Superman had to be reintroduced to the mainstream. Superman has to be reintroduced to his humanity, to Clark Kent, to his mundane life at the Daily Planet, to the people that work there, Jimmy, Perry White, and what does he discover? That Lois, his other tether to humanity, wrote an entire piece about how everyone is better off without him, how she moved on from both Superman and Clark. Not that there was anything other than a work relationship with Clark, but Jimmy got him a cake. Perry ignoring him is par for the course of the busy newspaper editor. But no card left on his desk, a message for Jimmy to give to him. Clark coming back barely affects her. And we learn that before we even see Lois properly, before she interacts with Clark and Superman that reinforces that. And yes, Lex's defeat happens mostly off-screen, where he's stranded on an island, and Superman really had no part in that, but the movie was, again, a character piece, so the defeat wasn't the big finale. It was Superman's recovery, which, by the way, I felt more raw emotion and sadness during that than when Superman died in Batman v Superman. Lex's fate is also pointless because had there been sequels, he would have been back to cause trouble sooner or later. It's a foregone conclusion of Superman stories that it's always going to be Superman versus Lex. I've also seen many people say that it wasn't bad, but it was forgettable, which also wouldn't incline DC to make a sequel to a movie that no one remembered. And maybe that's true. I certainly remember it, but a forgettable first movie hasn't stopped Disney from moving forward with a sequel to Avatar, a movie that I know I've seen at least once all the way through, but I can't remember a single plot element apart from the premise. And even if that sequel goes nowhere and is never made, they still dedicated an entire expansion of their theme park to it. A movie that no one remembers. Superman is more so important to DC because there will always be a need for him. Others claim that the movie failed to make money. The budget-to-box office ratio is comparable to, and in fact better than Batman Begins, which heralded a new era of Batman helmed by Christopher Nolan. Not as good as Man of Steel made a decade later, but for the time it didn't do too shabby. So that can't be it. And a big thing I've seen is that the movie isn't realistic enough and is too cheesy. But like I said earlier, that was sort of the point, because this movie was a love letter to Richard Donner, a love letter to the first two, and some would say only good Superman films. I would compare the cheesiness to the sillier parts of Chris Evans's portrayal of Steve Rogers in the MCU, since they're evoking the same era in the comics. Sure, Evans has gotten darker, but only starting in The Winter Soldier. Even Lex's ridiculous scheme for free real estate is reminiscent of the sillier aspects of Lex's character, even if Spacey doesn't really give the performance necessary for Lex to be a good villain. More importantly, Superman doesn't have to be dark and brooding like Batman because he's not Batman. He's the beacon of light of the DC universe, the big blue Boy Scout. Justice League kept saying that he was a pinnacle of hope, but in that movie, he wasn't, because he's dark and brooding. Reeves' Superman, Routh's Superman, they were beacons of hope, and that's not a bad thing to be. Especially in 2006, as well as today, hope is what we need more of in cinema. Superman Returns isn't perfect. Does the movie have flaws? Of course it does. No movie is without them, and one flaw of this movie, that I will admit to, is that the continuity is really muddled. And that's not entirely their fault, it's more so the fault of the production back during the Reeve movies, kicking out Richard Donner during Superman 2 and producing two craptastic sequels that Singer rightfully jettisoned when he made this movie. But that creates a whole host of problems when you try to figure out when this movie takes place. If it's supposed to be 5 years after Superman 2, then why do camera phones and modern computers exist? It's like the 1980s by way of 2006. Even for a comic book movie, it doesn't mesh with the established tech level of the previous film. Plus, the real weak link of the acting comes from Lex himself. Kevin Spacey is a poor replacement for Gene Hackman. I almost feel like putting Hackman in the movie and ignoring that he was 3 decades older than everyone else would have been better. Spacey works for a subdued performance. Hackman's Luthor was a showman, charismatic, more interesting. One can argue that 5 years in prison might have sedated him, but I don't like that explanation. Eisenberg was too manic, Spacey is too sedate. Hackman figured out the balance between comic book and menacing, which is why it's so disappointing that Spacey didn't manage to live up to it. And because I would be remiss if I neglected to mention it, yes, Kevin Spacey and Bryan Singer have both been accused of sexual misconduct, assault, and pedophilia. But two bad eggs don't completely negate the positives of this movie, especially since that, as proven by the J. Paul Getty movie, Spacey can be completely replaced, and they could have gotten someone else to do the hypothetical sequel, because it's not like Bryan Singer was credited as the sole writer. There were 2 other people writing the movie, so we don't know how much of it was necessarily him. And like I said earlier, Kate Bosworth is a weak Lois Lane, and perhaps it's her age. Being 7 years younger than Margot Kidder was during her first time as Lois Lane, that contributed to that. Her Lois Lane was meant to be a continuation, but she didn't have the experience to portray that. Routh also lacked experience, but he was able to bring something to Superman, while Bosworth did nothing noteworthy with Lois Lane. And the entire angle with Lois's son being half Kryptonian, sequel bait that never managed to hook on to anything, was a bad third-act focus, but it at the very least gave a satisfying nod to Jor-El's words to Kal-El, the father becoming the son stuff from the old movies. There's also minor gripes, the costume isn't great, but at the very least the color balance is better than the current movies, though I agree that the S-shield is way too small. But that's outweighed by brilliant sequences, like when Clark walks through the newsroom hearing all of Superman's feats from the previous day, where he saved the day in big and small ways, which is a great way of showing us how Superman operates, and how he should operate in all movies. Again, harping on the current ones, Superman barely tackles any local crime and mainly focuses on saving Lois, where in Returns, he helps everyone out. Plus, that sequence where he carries the island made of the one thing that can kill him and falls back to Earth is also chilling in a good way. And it's slow in some parts, but in most places the pacing is decent, and I don't know, I prefer some room to breathe between action sequences, rather than the rapid-fire cuts we see in most blockbuster action movies. But that isn't to say that Superman Returns is a lackluster sequel to Superman 2. Yeah, it's not as good, but few movies are. Superman 2 is a classic. It does things differently, and yeah, some of it didn't exactly work out right, but it's miles ahead of Superman 3 and 4, and what it does right, it does way better than Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. Hell, there's a crap ton of collateral damage in this movie, but Superman works hard to save the people first before going after Lex. Even when he knows Lois is in danger, he saves the city first. He is Superman, and he damn sure acts like it. Different doesn't equal bad. Giving Clark an actual rival for Lois's affections in Richard, and having Lois save Superman for a change, are just two of the really interesting things that this movie does with the Superman mythos. Plus, remember all that stuff I said about what made Superman 2 good and memorable? There's a lot of memorable stuff in this movie. The bullet and newsroom scenes I mentioned earlier, Routh's evocative performance, that hospital scene, the part where Lex's assistant distracts Superman and he saves her, and especially the intimate character moments. Factoring that in, it's actually the best Superman movie since Superman 2. So, if Superman Returns was in fact a good movie, recognized at the time for being good, and most criticisms were minor, and in fact were the minority of reviews, even if they had Ebert-level critics bashing it, why didn't we ever get Superman 6? And why did it take 7 years to get another Superman movie, and why, when we finally did get it, was it a reboot, ignoring all the other movies? I think that the reason that there was never a sequel was because the world wasn't ready for it. Now, I don't have any official verification for this, it's just based on what I know about Hollywood and the state of superhero movies in general, but it can be largely forgotten by many people today that superhero movies weren't mainstream until about 10 years ago, when Iron Man revitalized the idea and gave us the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and DC's poor attempts to crib that success. At the time that Superman Returns released, we had good ones like Hellboy, Zorro, X-Men, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, and a glut of crappy superhero movies. But one movie gave DC the credibility to try to revitalize the big three. And what was that? Well, it's quite simple.
The Batman.
The year before, we got Batman Begins, which was a return to form to the darker Batman that was seen in Tim Burton's Batman, and to a lesser extent in the DC animated universe. Keep in mind that before that, the last live-action Batman was Clooney in Batman and Robin, so compared to ice puns and bat credit cards, anything was a welcome change. And the people saw Batman Begins, and the people loved it. Nolan was well known, Bale gave the audiences what they wanted, a stellar supporting cast including Michael Caine, Morgan Freeman, and Gary Oldman, and this showed people what a superhero movie could be. More importantly, it showed DC what was profitable, namely 2 equally grim and gritty sequels. Unfortunately, it meant that lighter heroes would get dropped to the wayside. Throw in all the minor problems that the movie had, the lackluster reception it got, and the critical distaste, Superman once again left the silver screen. Man of Steel, despite being a box office success, is not the Superman that I want to see. It's a flawed movie, but because of Batman Begins and the success of Nolan's trilogy, it's what DC thinks works. And in some cases, like Batman, a hero that lives in the darkness is what works. But for a hero that gets his powers from a bright yellow sun, I'd rather see optimism and humanity shine through the clouds. And Superman Returns, for good and for bad, did just that.